In the glittering world of New York's elite, where legacy is everything and your last name is your ticket, some people are simply invisible. They are the ones who serve, who clean, who disappear into the background. Grace Washington was one of them. For the obscenely wealthy Harrington family, she was just the maid, a ghost in a grey uniform. On the night of their annual gala, amidst the clinking of champagne glasses and cruel, careless laughter, that ghost did the unthinkable. She walked towards the family's priceless, untouched Bösendorfer grand piano, the centerpiece of their ostentatious home, and sat down. The laughter that followed was sharp and mocking, a sound that could cut glass. But in the next 10 minutes, that laughter would die, replaced by a silence so profound, so full of shock and shame, that it would shatter their perfect world forever. This is the story of how a single piece of music revealed the ugly truth hiding behind a billion-dollar fortune. Grace Washington understood the geography of invisibility. It was in the way she learned to walk silently on marble floors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound to announce her presence. It was in the way she kept her eyes downcast, her gaze tracing the intricate patterns of Persian rugs rather than meeting the indifferent eyes of her employers. For the past 2 years, her world had been confined to the Harrington estate, a sprawling limestone behemoth on Long Island's Gold Coast that felt less like a home and more like a museum to its own wealth. Her life hadn't always been this way. There was a time before the grey uniform, a time when her world was one of ivory and ebony keys. Grace had been a prodigy, a name whispered with reverence in the halls of the Baltimore School for the Arts. Her fingers, which now scrubbed and polished, had once danced across the keys of a well-loved Steinway, coaxing out the soul of Chopin and the fire of Rachmaninoff. Juilliard hadn't been a dream. It had been a certainty, an acceptance letter framed on the wall of her father's modest home. Then life, in its cruel and indifferent way, had intervened. Her father, James Washington, a man who had worked 2 jobs his entire life to pay for her lessons, was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of motor neuron disease. The medical bills piled up like snowdrifts in a blizzard, burying them in debt. The Juilliard acceptance became a painful reminder of a door that had slammed shut. Grace dropped out of the conservatory, sold her family's piano, and took the first job she could find that paid enough to keep the lights on and the debt collectors at bay, a live-in maid for the Harrington family. The Harringtons were titans of finance, a dynasty built on ruthless acquisitions and old money. Walter Harrington was the patriarch, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. Grace, he saw, was a functional asset, efficient and quiet. His wife, Beatrice, was another matter entirely. She was a woman sculpted from ice, her kindness reserved only for those whose net worth met her exacting standards. To Beatrice, the staff were not people. They were functions. Grace was the help, a necessary but distasteful part of the scenery. Beatrice's voice, a carefully modulated aristocratic drawl, could deliver a compliment that felt like an insult or a simple instruction that dripped with condescension. She would often leave a single deliberate fingerprint on a freshly polished table, and without looking at Grace say to a guest, "It's simply impossible to find good help these days." Their daughter Olivia was a puzzle. At 18, she was a product of her environment, impeccably dressed listlessly, scrolling through her phone and speaking with a practiced air of boredom. Yet Grace sometimes saw flickerings of something else, a sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, a frustration in the way she'd slam her laptop shut after a video call with her father. The heart of the house, and the source of Grace's secret pain, was the music room. It was dominated by a Bösendorfer imperial grand piano. It wasn't just a piano, it was a legend. Its gleaming black lacquer and extra bass keys made it one of the most coveted instruments in the world. It was Walter's prized possession, a showpiece he had acquired at a Christie's auction. It was also a monument to profound irony, because in the 2 years Grace had worked there, not a single person had ever played it. It was kept perfectly tuned by a specialist who came once a month, but its purpose was purely decorative. A silent testament to a wealth so vast it could afford to buy a voice and command it to be quiet. For Grace, cleaning the music room was a special kind of torture. She would run her dust cloth over the pristine keys, her fingers itching to press down, to feel the weighted response, to hear a single resonant note fill the sterile air. She could feel the music trapped inside the polished wood, a symphony locked away in a beautiful prison. Sometimes, when the family was out, she would sit on the velvet bench, her hands hovering inches above the keyboard, and play entire concertos in her head. She would close her eyes, and her phantom fingers would fly, the muscle memory still sharp and aching. She would feel the crescendo, the swell of the orchestra in her mind, the delicate touch of a pianissimo passage. Then she would open her eyes, and the silence of the room would rush in cold and absolute. Her father was declining. The calls home were harder. His voice, once a warm baritone that filled their small house, was now a strained whisper. The experimental treatments weren't working, but they were fantastically expensive. So Grace stayed. She absorbed the quiet humiliations. She polished the silver she cleaned up after people who had never cleaned anything in their lives. She wore the grey uniform like armor, a shield for the vibrant musical soul trapped within. She was invisible, and for now, invisibility was survival. But inside her, a storm was gathering, a desperate, silent scream of notes waiting for their release. The second Saturday of June was the date of the annual Harrington Foundation Gala, an event that was less about charity and more about the public coronation of Walter and Beatrice as the reigning monarchs of their social stratosphere. Staff were run ragged for weeks in preparation. Extra help was hired for the night, but Grace, as a full-time member of the household staff, bore the brunt of Beatrice's increasingly frantic and demanding commands. The floral arrangements, a drooping Grace. Did you not give them fresh water this morning? See to it, Beatrice would snap, not waiting for an answer, and tell the caterers the canapes are to be served at precisely 8:15. Not 8:14. Precision is the hallmark of class. Grace moved through the storm of preparations, like a phantom, her face a mask of calm efficiency. Inside, however, her heart was a leaden weight. That morning she'd had a call with her father's nurse. He'd had a bad night, and the doctor was suggesting a new medication, one that wasn't covered by their already strained insurance plan. The cost was astronomical. Grace had promised the nurse she would figure something out, a promise that tasted like ash in her mouth. She needed this job. She needed the stability, the paycheck that was immediately wired to a hospital billing department. As evening fell, the mansion transformed. Soft golden light spilled from every window. A string quartet played Vivaldi on the terrace, their music a polite, unobtrusive soundtrack to the main event, the arrival of the guests. Bentleys and Rolls-Royces crunched softly on the gravel driveway. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns that cost more than Grace's yearly salary drifted into the grand foyer, their laughter echoing off the marble. Grace's job for the evening was to be a shadow. She was to circulate collecting empty glasses and used napkins, ensuring that the pristine illusion of the Harrington home was never broken by the reality of refuse. She moved along the edges of conversations, her ears picking up snippets of lives, so alien they might as well have been from another planet. So I told him, A 90-foot yacht is simply not enough for the Mediterranean season. We're upgrading to the 120, flew to Milan for a fitting. But honestly, the new Versace line is a complete disaster. My son is at Harvard, of course. He's finding it a bit of a bore, but one must have the pedigree. It was a symphony of privilege, and Grace felt a familiar bitter pang. These people debated yachts, while she debated life-saving medicine. Around 10 o'clock, she was clearing glasses near the entrance to the music room when she saw Beatrice holding court with a small group of her closest friends, including a woman named Diane Chamberlain, whose husband ran a rival hedge fund. Diane was notoriously competitive with Beatrice, their friendship a thinly veiled performance of one-upmanship. Beatrice, a flute of champagne in her hand, gestured vaguely in Grace's direction as she passed. "You see what I mean?" she said, her voice low but perfectly audible. "The agency center. Supposedly has references, but honestly you can never be too sure. There's a sullenness about her. Don't you think?" Diane Chamberlain peered at Grace through narrowed eyes, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, they all have that look, darling. The resentment is practically part of the uniform. As long as she can manage a tray and doesn't steal the silverware, what more can you ask for?" A man Grace didn't recognize chuckled. "Careful, Beatrice. You let them get too comfortable, and they start thinking they're people." The small group laughed, a light, tittering sound that made Grace's blood run cold. She kept her back to them, her hands gripping the silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, dismissing her entire existence as a menial function. Sullenness, resentment. Not a person. The words were like physical blows. She turned to retreat to the kitchens, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere, but Beatrice's next words stopped her cold. "The funniest thing," Beatrice continued, leaning in conspiratorially the other day, "I came into the music room and she was just staring at the Bösendorfer, as if she had any idea what it even was. Can you imagine her with those hands touching something so exquisite?" The laughter that followed was louder this time, sharper and more cruel. It cut through the polite murmur of the party, and for Grace, it felt like the only sound in the world. It was a laughter that mocked not just her, but her father, her past, her lost dreams, the memory of her own hands on a piano. Everything she was, everything she had been, was being reduced to a joke for these vapid, heartless people. Something inside her, a string that had been stretched taut for 2 long years, finally snapped. The humiliation, the worry for her father, the constant suppression of her own identity, it all coalesced into a single, blinding point of clarity. She had been silent for too long. She had been invisible for too long. Her grief and rage churned within her, and suddenly she wasn't thinking about her job, her paycheck, or the consequences. She was thinking of the music trapped inside that piano, and the music trapped inside of her. She turned from the doorway, the silver tray still in her hands. She walked back towards the group, her steps no longer silent and hesitant, but deliberate and firm. The laughter died down as they saw her approaching, their expressions shifting from amusement to annoyance. "Is there a problem?" Beatrice asked, her voice laced with ice. Grace didn't answer. She walked past them into the hollowed space of the music room. She placed the tray of empty glasses silently on a side table. Then, with the eyes of every person in the vicinity on her, she walked towards the gleaming black Bösendorfer Imperial Grand, the heart of the house, the silent sleeping giant. As Grace approached the piano, a wave of whispers rippled through the guests closest to the music room. The string quartet on the terrace faltered for a moment, a violinist missing a note as heads turned. What was the maid doing? Beatrice's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" she hissed her voice, a low, dangerous command. "Get away from there. Now." Grace didn't look back. She reached the piano and gently, reverently ran her fingers along the closed lid, the polished wood, cool beneath her touch. For a moment she hesitated. The fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the heat of her anger. Firing was a certainty. A bad reference was a possibility. Losing the income that was keeping her father alive was a terrifying probability. Just as she was about to pull back, a voice surprisingly close cut through her panic. "What are you going to play?" Grace turned. It was Olivia Harrington. She had been lounging in a velvet armchair in the corner of the room, scrolling on her phone, seemingly oblivious to the party. But now she was standing, her arms crossed, her expression a strange mixture of defiance and curiosity. Her face, usually a canvas of teenage ennui, was alive with an unexpected intensity. Beatrice, seeing her daughter speaking to the maid, grew even more incensed. "Olivia, be quiet. This is unacceptable. Security." But Olivia didn't back down. She took a step closer to Grace, lowering her voice, so only they could hear, though her words were aimed like daggers at her mother. "They laugh at you because they don't see you," she said, her eyes flickering towards Beatrice and her friends, who were now frozen in a state of horrified fascination. "They don't see anyone. They just see uniforms and reflections of themselves." Grace stared at the girl, bewildered. In 2 years they had barely exchanged more than a few dozen words. Yet here she was, not joining the mockery, but seemingly offering encouragement. Olivia's gaze dropped to the piano keys. "I've seen you," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "In here, when you think no one's home. You never touch it, but you look at it, like you're saying goodbye to someone you love." The observation was so startlingly accurate that it took Grace's breath away. Olivia, the girl who seemed to notice nothing, had noticed everything. "My grandmother played," Olivia continued, a note of bitterness in her tone. "My father's mother. She was brilliant, they said. But her husband, my grandfather, thought it was an unseemly hobby for a woman of her station. He sold her piano. My father bought this one after she passed. He calls it a tribute, but it's just a monument. He never lets anyone play it. He's just as bad as his father was, just in a different way." It was a flood of confession, a glimpse behind the curtain of the perfect Harrington family. It revealed a shared history of silenced music, a pain that Olivia, in her own gilded cage, understood on some level. "They think so little of you," Olivia said, her eyes meeting Grace's hard and challenging. Show them who you are. What have you got to lose? A job you hate?" The words struck a chord deep within Grace. "What have you got to lose?" The question echoed the desperation that had been building in her for months. She looked past Olivia to Beatrice's furious face, to the smirking guests, to the whole glittering, hollow spectacle. And she realized Olivia was right. They had already taken her dream, her dignity, her identity. The only thing she had left was her music, and it was a secret they couldn't touch. Until now. The dare in Olivia's eyes was the final push she needed. It wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about reclamation. It was for her father, who deserved to know his sacrifices hadn't been for nothing. It was for the girl she used to be, the one who lived and breathed music. And it was for this strange, sad, rich girl who, in a moment of unexpected kinship, had handed her a reason. Grace gave Olivia a small, grateful nod. She took a deep breath, pulling the velvet-topped piano bench out. The scraping sound it made on the hardwood floor was shockingly loud in the now hushed room. She sat down, her posture straightening instinctively. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed, her hands hovering over the keys. It was a posture honed by thousands of hours of practice, a muscle memory that her body had never forgotten. The laughter had completely vanished, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The guests, drawn by the unfolding drama, began to crowd the doorway of the music room. This was a spectacle none of them had anticipated. The black maid, the invisible help, was about to touch the untouchable piano. Beatrice looked like she was on the verge of physically dragging Grace off the bench, but Walter, her husband, put a restraining hand on her arm, his own face, a grim, unreadable mask. He seemed for once intrigued. Grace looked down at her hands. These were not the hands of a concert pianist anymore. They were the hands of a maid. Calloused with a small burn mark on one knuckle from a hot pan, her nails cut short and practical. They were tired hands. But they remembered. She closed her eyes, shutting out the sea of stunned, judgmental faces. She pictured her father years ago, sitting in his favorite armchair, closing his eyes in bliss as she practiced. "Play it from your heart, Gracie," he would always say. "That's where the real music lives." She took one final cleansing breath, and then she began to play. The first notes that broke the silence were not gentle. They were a torrent, an explosion of sound that ripped through the stuffy, perfumed air of the Harrington mansion. Grace didn't choose a polite prelude or a gentle sonata. She chose Frédéric Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu in C-sharp minor. It was a piece of breathtaking difficulty, a cascade of racing arpeggios and intricate cross rhythms that demanded absolute technical mastery. It was a whirlwind, a furious expression of pent-up passion and pain. Her left hand laid down the relentless driving triplets, while her right hand flew across the keys, weaving a melody of 16th notes that was at once desperate and defiant. The sound that erupted from the Bösendorfer was magnificent. It was a voice that had been held silent for far too long, and it roared to life under Grace's command. The bass notes, enhanced by the piano's extra keys, were richer and deeper than anything the guests had ever heard, a resonant growl that vibrated through the floorboards and up into their bones. The treble was a shower of crystalline sparks. The immediate reaction was shock. Jaws literally dropped. Champagne glasses were held forgotten midway to lips. The condescending smirks on the faces of Beatrice's friends dissolved, replaced by looks of utter, stupefied disbelief. This wasn't the clumsy banging they had expected. This wasn't a party trick. This was a ferocious, world-class performance. Beatrice Harrington's face, which had been contorted with rage, slowly went slack with confusion. Her mind couldn't process the scene. The woman in the maid's uniform, the one she had just mocked for having hands unfit to touch the instrument, was playing it with a skill that bordered on supernatural. Diane Chamberlain looked at Beatrice, then back at Grace, her mouth a perfect O of astonishment. Walter Harrington's expression was the most complex. The grim mask had fallen away, revealing a raw, unguarded surprise. His eyes were fixed on Grace's hands, a blur of motion over the keys. He saw not a servant, but an artist, a master of her craft. He saw the passion that he recognized from a long-buried memory, the same fire he used to see in his own mother's eyes before his father had extinguished it. Olivia stood near the piano, a triumphant, vindicated smile spreading across her face. She had thrown down the dare, and Grace had answered with a declaration of war. As Grace moved into the slower, lyrical middle section of the piece, the mood in the room shifted from shock to something deeper. The fury of the opening gave way to a melody of profound, aching beauty. The notes were tender, full of longing, and a deep, resonant sadness. It was here that Grace's own story began to pour out. Every note was infused with her loss, her sacrifice, the love for her ailing father, the ghost of her Juilliard dream. She wasn't just playing Chopin. She was playing the last 2 years of her life. People in the crowd who had never listened to classical music a day in their lives were spellbound. The music transcended genre and class. It was pure, raw emotion, a story being told in a universal language. They were no longer seeing a maid. They were hearing a soul. Among the guests standing near the back of the crowd that had gathered was a man named Arthur Pendleton. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. To most people at the party, he was just another wealthy acquaintance of Walter's. But in the world of classical music, Arthur Pendleton was a kingmaker. He was the chief music critic for the New York Times and a known, though often anonymous, benefactor for the Juilliard School's Scholarship Fund. His reviews could launch careers or end them. He had come to the party out of a sense of obligation and had been profoundly bored. When the maid had walked to the piano, he had sighed with weary disdain, expecting an embarrassing spectacle. But from the first thunderous chord, he had gone rigid. He pushed his way gently through the crowd, his ears analyzing, his mind racing. He wasn't just hearing technical proficiency. He knew hundreds of pianists who were technically perfect. He was hearing something far rarer of voice. He heard the phrasing, the subtle dynamics, the emotional intelligence behind every note. This wasn't the playing of a student. This was the playing of a master who had lived it. Grace, lost in the music, was oblivious to it all. The room, the people, her uniform, it had all faded away. There was only her and the piano, their two voices finally united. As the fantasy impromptu raced towards its conclusion, reprising the stormy opening theme, she poured every last ounce of her frustration and defiance into the keys. The final powerful chords echoed through the mansion, seeming to shake the very foundations of the house. Then silence. It was a silence unlike any that had ever filled that room. It was not empty. It was heavy, thick with unspoken thoughts, with awe, with guilt, and with a profound sense of shame. No one moved. No one breathed. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint, lingering resonance of the final chord fading into the air. The spectacle the guests had expected had happened, but the joke, they were all sickeningly aware, was on them. Grace Washington had not just played the piano. She had held up a mirror to every single person in the room, and the reflection was ugly. The silence was finally broken by a single person clapping. It started slowly, deliberately. Arthur Pendleton, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, brought his hands together. The sound was stark in the quiet room. Then a few others, mesmerized, joined in. Soon the room was filled with a wave of applause, hesitant at first, then growing into a thunderous ovation. It was not the polite, reserved applause of a society gala. It was a genuine, explosive acknowledgement of the breathtaking talent they had just witnessed. Grace slowly opened her eyes, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. The sound of the applause brought her crashing back to reality. She looked out at the sea of faces, faces that hours ago had ignored her faces, that minutes ago had been twisted in mockery, and saw nothing but undisguised awe. She saw Walter Harrington, his face pale, staring at her, as if seeing a ghost. She saw Diane Chamberlain and the others in Beatrice's circle, their expressions a mixture of shock and deep embarrassment. And then she saw Beatrice. The applause had no effect on her. Her face was white, with a rage that was colder and harder than anything Grace had seen before. This was not just about a servant stepping out of line. This was a fundamental violation of the world order as Beatrice understood it. Grace had not only embarrassed her in front of her friends and rivals, she had stolen the spotlight at her party, using her prized possession. As the applause began to die down, Beatrice strode forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "That's enough," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "The circus is over. You," she pointed a finger at Grace, "are fired. Get your things and get out of my house. Now!" The command was so harsh, so jarring after the beauty of the music, that a collective gasp went through the crowd. Firing the maid was one thing, but to do it so cruelly after a performance like that felt obscene. Before Grace could even react, Olivia stepped between her and her mother. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You will not." "Olivia, get out of my way," Beatrice seethed. "This does not concern you." "It does," Olivia retorted, her eyes flashing. "For years, all I've heard about is the Harrington legacy, about class, about appreciating the finer things. Well, this," she gestured wildly at Grace, "is it? This is talent. This is genius, and you're too blind and petty to see it because she's wearing a uniform." Walter Harrington finally moved, placing a hand on Beatrice's shoulder. "Beatrice, perhaps we should discuss this later," he said, his voice low. "There is nothing to discuss," she shrieked, shrugging off his hand. "She is a servant who has forgotten her place." It was at that moment that Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, his calm, authoritative presence immediately commanding the room's attention. He ignored Beatrice completely, his eyes fixed solely on Grace. "Young woman," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight. "That was the most moving rendition of the fantasy impromptu I have heard in 20 years, and I have heard it played by the best in the world." Beatrice scoffed. "And who are you to—" Walter cut her off, his eyes widening in recognition. "Beatrice, stop. Do you know who this is?" "This is Arthur Pendleton." The name dropped into the room like a 10-ton weight. Whispers erupted. The Arthur Pendleton. From the times Beatrice's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She had just tried to dismiss one of the most powerful cultural critics in the country. The social misstep was catastrophic. Pendleton, still paying her no mind, continued speaking to Grace. "Your technique is flawless, but it's more than that. You have a soul in your playing, a story. Where did you study?" Grace found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. I was accepted to Juilliard. I attended for a semester." Pendleton nodded slowly, as if a piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place. "And why did you leave?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes. The whole story was too much to explain too raw. "My father," she managed to say. "He's sick. I had to." Her voice broke. An expression of deep understanding and compassion softened Pendleton's features. He looked at her, not as a critic, not as a wealthy man, but as one human being seeing another's pain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. He walked to the piano and placed it on the music stand. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," he said, his voice resounding in the now completely silent room. "I sit on the admissions and scholarship board for the graduate program at Juilliard. We have a special fund, the Starlight Endowment, for artists of exceptional promise who have had their careers interrupted by hardship. It covers full tuition and provides a living stipend." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "On Monday morning," he said, looking directly into Grace's eyes, "I want you to call the number on that card. Tell them I sent you. We will arrange an audition. This," he gestured around the opulent room at the gawking guests and the humiliated Harringtons, "is not your place. Your place is on a concert stage." He turned, gave a curt, dismissive nod to Walter, and walked out of the room. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. His verdict had been delivered, and with it he had completely dismantled Beatrice Harrington's social standing and rewritten Grace Washington's future in the space of 2 minutes. Grace stared at the business card. Arthur Pendleton, Juilliard. It was a lifeline, a miracle born from a moment of sheer desperation. She looked up and met Olivia's gaze. The girl's eyes were shining with tears, and she gave Grace a smile that was pure, unadulterated joy. The spell was broken. The guests, avoiding eye contact with Beatrice, began to murmur excuses and make a hasty retreat. The party was over. A world had been turned upside down, all by the power of a young woman in a grey uniform who had dared to play the piano. Once the last guest had fled, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the Harrington mansion. The grand foyer, which had been alive with chatter and music, was now a cavern of shame. Half-eaten canapés congealed on silver trays. Abandoned champagne flutes littered the tables. The string quartet had packed up and left without a word. The 3 Harringtons and Grace stood in the music room, a tableau of the evening's emotional wreckage. Beatrice was shaking her face, a mask of pale fury. Olivia stood defiantly by Grace's side. Walter looked as if he had aged 10 years, his gaze fixed on the Bösendorfer. "How could you?" Beatrice finally whispered, her voice a venomous rasp directed at Grace. "How dare you humiliate me in my own home?" "She didn't humiliate you." Mother Olivia shot back, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "You humiliated yourself." All she did was tell the truth. "The truth," Beatrice laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The truth is that she is paid to serve, not to perform. This is an employee who has grievously overstepped her bounds." She turned to Walter, her eyes pleading for support. "Walter, are you going to just stand there?" "Say something?" Walter finally moved. He walked slowly towards the piano, not looking at Grace or his wife, but at the instrument itself. He gently touched the keys, a mirror of the gesture Grace had made earlier. "My mother loved to play," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking to himself. "She was a wonderful pianist, gifted. She wanted to play professionally at Carnegie Hall. That was her dream." He looked up, his eyes filled with a distant sorrow. "My father forbade it. He said it was undignified for a Harrington. He said her place was at home hosting parties, raising a son. He bought her expensive jewelry, beautiful gowns, anything she wanted, except her music. He made her stop playing. It broke her spirit. She was never truly happy again." He finally turned his gaze from the piano to Grace, and for the first time she saw not an employer, but a man haunted by his family's past. "When I bought this piano after she died," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I told myself it was a tribute to her. But Olivia was right. It was just a monument, a beautiful, expensive, silent monument to a dream that I let stay dead. I was just like him. I saw this incredible instrument as a status symbol to be polished, not a voice to be heard." He looked at Beatrice, his expression hardening. "Tonight, for the first time in decades, this house was filled with the kind of passion my mother had. And your first instinct was to silence it, to punish it for being in the wrong social class, just like my father did." The comparison struck Beatrice like a physical blow. To be compared to her stern, overbearing father-in-law was the ultimate insult. She paled, speechless. Walter then looked at Grace. "What she did tonight was not an act of insubordination," he said, his voice firm. "It was a gift we were too arrogant and too ignorant to deserve." He turned to his wife. "She is not fired, Beatrice, and we will be making a contribution to this Starlight endowment Mr. Pendleton mentioned, a significant one. This was Walter Harrington's verdict. It was not driven by kindness, perhaps, but by a sudden, shocking confrontation with his own history and his own failings. It was an act of penance for the ghost of his mother. Beatrice stared at him, utterly defeated. She had lost her husband's support, been defied by her daughter, and been publicly humiliated. Without another word, she turned and swept out of the room, her proud, rigid posture the only defense she had left. The tension finally broke. Olivia let out a shaky breath and threw her arms around Grace in an impulsive, awkward hug. "You were incredible," she whispered. "Absolutely incredible." Grace, overwhelmed by the emotional whiplash of the last hour, hugged her back, tears of relief and disbelief streaming down her face. "Thank you, Olivia. I couldn't have done it without you." Later that night, long after Walter and Olivia had retired, Grace sat alone in her small, sterile room in the staff quarters. The grey uniform was folded neatly on a chair. In her hand, she held the crisp white business card. Arthur Pendleton. It felt heavier than a simple piece of paper. It felt like the weight of a future. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the nursing home. It was late, but she had to tell him. A sleepy nurse answered. "Can I please speak to James Washington?" Grace asked, her heart pounding. "It's his daughter, Grace. It's important." After a moment, she heard the fumbling sound of the phone being passed over, and then her father's weak, whispered voice. "Gracie." "Is everything all right, Grace?" Choked back a sob, this one not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "You know how you always told me that my music would take me places. Of course, baby girl. I always believed that. Well, I think it's finally going to happen. I'm going to play again, Dad. I'm really going to play." She told him everything that had happened, the party, the piano, the offer. She didn't tell him about the mockery or the cruelty. She only told him about the music and the hope. And for the first time in 2 years, the conversation wasn't about medical bills or declining health. It was about a dream once thought dead being brought gloriously back to life. 3 months later, the world looked different. The Long Island mansion with its cold marble and silent piano felt like a distant, half-remembered dream. Grace now stood in a small sunlit practice room at the Juilliard School in Manhattan. The room wasn't grand. It contained only an upright piano, a chair, and a music stand. But to Grace it was a palace. It was hers. The Starlight Endowment had been everything Mr. Pendleton had promised, and more. It covered her tuition for the graduate program in piano performance, and provided a modest stipend enough to live in a small apartment nearby, and most importantly, to ensure her father's medical care was secure and of the best quality. Walter Harrington, true to his word, had made a 7-figure donation to the fund in his mother's name, a gesture that had shocked the philanthropic community and served as a quiet, public atonement. Grace's official audition had been a formality. With Pendleton as her champion, the faculty had been eager to hear her. She had played Brahms and Liszt, and when she was finished, the panel of stern-faced professors had given her a standing ovation. She was in. Her relationship with the Harringtons had changed in ways she never could have predicted. She had, of course, resigned her position. The day she left, Walter had met with her personally, handing her a check that amounted to 5 years' salary. For your father, he had said, his eyes filled with a quiet respect, and as an apology from a man who should have been listening. Olivia had become a true friend. They texted regularly, and Olivia often took the train into the city to have lunch with Grace. She had enrolled in a music composition class at Columbia, a decision she'd made the week after the gala. "You woke something up," Olivia had told her. "Not just in me. In the whole house." The Bösendorfer was no longer silent. Olivia was learning to play it, and Walter had hired a professional pianist to come twice a week to play for him, filling the halls with the music his mother had loved. Beatrice remained distant, but the entire affair had humbled her. The story of the Harrington Gala had become a legend in New York society, a cautionary tale about underestimating the help. Today was Grace's first masterclass with the legendary pianist, Madame Irina Volkov, a notoriously demanding instructor. Grace sat at the piano, her heart pounding with nerves, but it was a different kind of fear now. It wasn't the fear of being fired or humiliated. It was the thrilling, electric fear of an artist about to be tested about to push the limits of her own talent. She was no longer Grace Washington, the maid. She was Grace Washington, the Juilliard artist. Her grey uniform was gone, replaced by simple black slacks and a blue blouse. Her hands, no longer rough from cleaning chemicals, were strong and supple. Madame Volkov, an imposing woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, nodded at her. "What will you be playing for us, Miss Washington?" Grace took a breath. She wasn't going to play Chopin or Rachmaninoff. She wasn't playing to prove her fury or her technical skill anymore. She was playing for herself now. She had chosen a piece by the 20th century black composer, Florence Price, a beautiful, soulful fantasy that blended the traditions of European classical music with the melodies of African-American spirituals. It was a piece about resilience, about sorrow, and about a deep, unshakable hope. It was her story. She placed her fingers on the keys. She thought of her father now resting more comfortably, his future secure. She thought of Olivia finding her own voice. She thought of Mr. Pendleton's belief in her. She thought of the long, silent nights in the Harrington mansion. Then she let it all go. She played. The first notes filled the room, not with rage, but with a quiet, profound grace. It was the sound of a dream deferred, finally realized. It was the sound of a soul once invisible, now seen. It was the sound of a new beginning, a powerful overture to a life that was at long last her own. 2 years can feel like a lifetime. For Grace Washington, they represented a complete rebirth. The shy, invisible maid who polished a silent piano was a ghost of the past, a story she sometimes had to remind herself was real. The woman who now stood in the wings of the Stern Auditorium at Carnegie Hall was an artist, her name printed in elegant script on the evening's program. This wasn't a student recital or a masterclass. This was her professional debut, a sold-out performance with the New York Philharmonic. The journey from the Juilliard practice rooms to this hallowed stage had been a blur of relentless work, fierce competition, and the unwavering mentorship of Arthur Pendleton. He had opened every door, but she was the one who had walked through them, her talent silencing any doubters. Backstage in her private dressing room, the scent of roses and lilies from well-wishers filled the air. A sleek black gown hung on the door, a stark contrast to the grey uniform she once wore as a second skin. She looked in the mirror, seeing not the sullen, resentful girl Beatrice Harrington had described, but a woman whose eyes shone with a calm, focused intensity. Her hands, once calloused from labour, were now simply strong, resting in her lap, waiting. A gentle knock came at the door. It was Olivia Harrington, her face beaming with an excitement that was infectious. 5 minutes, Gracie. She said, her voice a happy whisper. How are you feeling? Like I'm about to jump out of a plane and fly at the same time, Grace admitted with a laugh. Olivia's friendship had been a constant anchor. She was now a promising composition student at Juilliard herself, her own musical voice emerging from the shadow of her family's legacy. You're going to be amazing, Olivia said, squeezing her hand. Just remember who you are. Grace nodded. I will. As Olivia left, Grace's eyes drifted to a small tablet set up on her dressing table. It was open to a private live video feed, connected to a room in a specialized care facility upstate. On the screen, she could see her father, James Washington, propped up in his bed. He was weak of the disease having taken its inevitable toll, but his eyes were bright, fixed on the screen. The Harringtons' donation, combined with Grace's own income from early professional engagements, had ensured he had the best comfort and care money could buy. He couldn't be here in person, but he was here in spirit. This night was as much for him as it was for her. When she walked onto the stage, the sheer scale of the hall, the tiers of velvet seats, the vast, gilded ceiling, took her breath away. The thunderous applause that greeted her was a warm, welcoming wave. She bowed to the audience, to the conductor, and then sat at the magnificent Steinway concert grand that waited for her at the center of it all. As her eyes scanned the crowd, she saw them. In a box to the left of the stage sat Arthur Pendleton, looking on with the quiet pride of a father figure. Next to him were Walter and Olivia Harrington. Olivia was practically vibrating with excitement. Walter looked different, softer, the hard edges of the ruthless CEO worn away. His eyes were fixed on her with an expression of profound, almost reverent respect. He wasn't just watching a performer, he was witnessing a resurrection, the redemption of a dream his own family had once crushed. Even Beatrice was there seated next to him, her posture as rigid as ever, but she was present, a silent admission of a new world order she could no longer deny. Grace took a deep, centering breath, and as the orchestra began the introduction to Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, she closed her eyes. She wasn't in Carnegie Hall anymore. She was back in her childhood living room, the scent of her father's coffee in the air. She was in the cold, silent music room of the Harrington estate, her hands aching to play. She was at Juilliard fighting to reclaim her future. Every moment of her journey, every humiliation, every small victory had led to this. Then her hands met the keys, and her own story began. The music that poured forth was not just technically brilliant, it was emotionally transcendent. The concerto's famous opening chords were not just loud, they were a declaration, the tolling of a bell announcing her arrival. She played with a power and passion that stunned the audience into absolute silence. She navigated the most difficult passages with an effortless grace, her fingers a blur on the keys. But it was in the concerto's tender lyrical moments that she truly soared. She poured all the love for her father, all the gratitude for her allies, and even a strange sense of forgiveness for her tormentors into the melody. She was telling her story, a story of loss, of struggle, and of ultimate triumph. It was the sound of a spirit uncaged. As the final triumphant movement reached its crescendo, the orchestra swelling around her, Grace played with a joy that was pure and unrestrained. The final thunderous chords echoed through the hall, a definitive statement of arrival. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then the entire hall erupted. The audience was on its feet, the applause not just polite, but explosive and raw. Shouts of brava rained down from the balconies. Flowers were brought to the stage as she took bow after bow, her face wet with tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked towards the Harringtons' box and saw Walter on his feet, clapping harder than anyone, his own face etched with an emotion too deep for words. Later that night, long after the applause had faded and the last well-wishers had gone home, Grace sat in her quiet apartment. The congratulatory text messages were still buzzing on her phone, but she ignored them. She picked it up and looked at the one message that mattered. It was from the nurse who helped her father. It was a photo of him taken just moments after the performance ended, a wide, joyful smile on his face. Below it was a simple text dictated by him. "You played it from your heart, Gracie. I heard every single note." Grace closed her eyes, holding the phone to her chest. She was no longer a maid, no longer a student. She was a master, her name, now etched in the annals of the Great Hall. But in that quiet, peaceful moment, she was simply James Washington's daughter, a girl who had held on to her music, and in doing so, had saved them both. Grace's story is a powerful reminder that talent, passion, and human dignity can never be confined by a uniform or a job title. It shows us how the most beautiful art can bloom in the most unexpected places, and how one single act of courage can shatter a world of prejudice. We all have a Bösendorfer in our lives, a priceless, silent potential waiting to be unlocked. Grace's journey challenges us to look past the surfaces, to see the person behind the role they play, and to listen for the music that so many people are forced to keep silent. The world is full of hidden genius in kitchens, in cleaning carts, and in quiet corners. What would happen if we all dared to listen? Thank you for joining us for this incredible story. If it moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that inspires, challenges, and reminds us of the power of the human spirit. Until next time,